Welcome to Crisis and Hope, YU Voices. Crisis and Hope is a project of the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, and Judaic Studies at YU, Mada'ai HaYahadut. My name is Jess Olson, and I'm a professor of Jewish history here at Yeshiva University. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Krishauna Hines-Gaither and Gwen Erickson of Guilford College. Krishauna Hines-Gaither is the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and she also directs the Intercultural Engagement Center at Guilford College. Her research interests are transnational feminism, African diaspora studies, and African influences in Latin American and Francophone countries. She has completed a forthcoming chapter on the complexities of Quaker abolition that will soon be published by Routledge Press. Gwen Erickson, Quaker Archives and Special Collections Library at Guilford College, has served in her current but ever-evolving position at Guilford College since 2000. Her own scholarly research interests as a historian focus on the intersections of Quaker studies, African-American history, women's studies, and 19th century US social justice movements, and the ways that faith and identity form our historical narratives. She has a passion for sharing resources and connecting people to history through access to primary sources that deepen our understanding of the human experience in its many complexities. And I'd like to just say a couple of words about Guilford College and its program. Guilford College is a private college founded by the Society of Friends, Quakers, and is located in Greensboro, North Carolina. It seeks to honor its abolitionist roots while interrogating its complicity in the larger system of white supremacy. Through its membership in the university's Studying Slavery Consortium, Guilford College acknowledges the need to delve deeper into the campus's history related to slavery. The college seeks to honor its abolitionist roots while interrogating its complexity in a larger system of white supremacy. Krishauna Hines-Gaither, Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Gwen Erickson, Quaker Archives, co-chair the Curry-Coffin Commission on Slavery, Race, and Recognition in collaboration with several students, staff, faculty, alumni, and community members. Work predating their USS membership included their underground railroad trail and K-12 curriculum, recognition of their Quaker Archives as a research facility, and their campus property as a site in the National Park Service's National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program, and ongoing campus anti-racism work. As we acknowledge the complexity and complicity of our past and wrestle with its enduring legacies, they esteem the important work of universities studying slavery and are active members of the group. Universities Studying Slavery, USS, is a multi-institutional collaboration as part of an effort to facilitate mutual support in the pursuit of common goals around the core of engaging in a better understanding of slavery and its legacies in relation to our educational institutions. When we began the series Crisis and Hope in June, we wanted to create a forum that would go beyond the headlines and tweets and talking points that often pass for political and cultural discourse. We wanted a space for nuance, depth, and perspective. We believe that the past can inform and bring light to the present and even give us hope in moments of confusion and despair. With that, let's get started. So please welcome Krishauna Hines-Gaither and Gwen Erickson, and they will be speaking this evening on Complicated Legacies. Excuse me, I lost the title. Complicated Legacies, which I will ask my guests to give the full title. I apologize, my technical glitches, but thank you so much for being with us tonight. Very pleased to have you here. I would also like to shout out to my students in our class, Blacks and Jews in America. I would like to welcome also our provost, Selma Botman, and the dean of our undergraduate education, Dr. Karen Bacon. Very nice to see you all. And with that, I will turn it over to Krishauna and Gwen.
Thank you so much for having us this evening. We're excited to share with you. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. So our title, Complicated Legacies, Quaker Abolitionism and Slavery. And I do this work with my colleague, Gwen Erickson, and you'll hear from her right after I finish. And I'll speak to you for about 30 minutes. Let's see, it's about 7:10. So I'll speak to you for about 30 minutes, and then Gwen will speak to you for about the same amount of time. And then we will take questions after that. So we should have 25 minutes or so left for questions. So let's just jump right in.
Krishauna, if I could
Yes.
interrupt you just for 1 second,
Yes.
I apologize.
Mm-hmm.
If folks do have questions during the talk, please feel free to put them into the chat of the Zoom, and I will read them out at the end as they arrive. Thank you. Sorry about the interruption.
Awesome, no problem. Get my clicker in here. Okay, there we go. All right. So I'm going to kind of frame my talk for you. I will make a few connections between not necessarily your institution, but between Judaism and also Quaker faith. And so I'll make some connections, not necessarily strong connections, but definitely some engagement that the two communities have had over a period of centuries. And so we will certainly talk about that. And then part of our work with universities studying slavery is to complicate our legacy. And so the purpose of this work is to research our history, interrogate our history, and sometimes that affirms what we already knew, but oftentimes it troubles the narrative that we may have grown up believing or may have studied in schools or that has been promoted even with our own institution. And so we will talk about some of those complexities of that legacy tonight. All right. So first of all, George Fox, he was a prolific writer and he left us a lot of documents. George Fox is the founder of the Quaker faith. He left us many, many documents today that we can still read and that give a lot of insights into the times. And so in the 17th century, he was very focused on proselytizing many enslaved populations as well as Jewish populations. And so we have several writings where he spoke about proselytizing Jewish communities. And so George Fox says, "And whilst I was at Worcester, I gave forth several books, one to you Jews, to prove that the Messiah had come by the prophets above 1600 years since." And so he's trying to make a case to the Jews that Christ is the Messiah, trying to get them to believe this. In 1677, George Fox wrote, George gave forth a book for you Jews, for when he was at Amsterdam, he sent to them to have a discourse with them, but they refused. And so you get so many insights into his trying to get into this Jewish community, prove to them who the Messiah is, as he knows him to be, as Christ, and they're refusing to meet with him. There are other records where a Jewish family does meet with him, and he's so excited that he didn't change their mind, but he's so excited that they did allow for him to come to his home. They had dinner with him, and they did meet with him. And so these are some of those early George Fox writings. His wife, Margaret Fell, known as the mother of Quakerism, she too felt very compelled to prove to the Jewish community that Christ was the Messiah and that he had come. And so she employed the work of an excommunicated Jew, Baruch Spinoza, which many of you probably are familiar with. Spinoza had fallen out of favor with the Jewish community for speaking against some of the tradition of the Jewish faith. And even with his parents, they had pretty much, excommunicated him because he was speaking against a lot of the traditions of the Jewish community. And so, but Margaret Fell thought this would make for a great collaboration. And so she hires him, employs him to help her to translate many of the documents that she wants to share with the Jewish communities of Holland and Germany. She also works with other rabbis as well to translate these writings. So you're seeing a lot of early engagement with Jewish communities and Quakers, mostly for the purpose of evangelism and proselytization. And so then we have in 1917, we have the beginning of the American Friends Service Committee. And so the committee, led by Rufus Jones in Philadelphia area, just a few decades later, they open a refugee division. And this will become extremely important given what's happening in Europe. And so over 22,000 individuals, not all Jews, but many of them Jews, are ferried to safety through this American Friends Service Committee, over 22,000 during World War I and II. And so by 1947, this organization would receive the Nobel Peace Prize for these rescue efforts and early relief efforts. And so I want to show a quick video. It's about 3 minutes of this relationship between the American Friends Services Committee and also the Jewish community. And I will say that this also brings in the abolitionist aspect that Gwen and I will be talking about today. So it kind of triangulates a lot of those spaces of Judaism, Friends, and also abolition. And for those who may not be familiar with Quakers, Quakers was founded as the religious society of Friends. And so today we use the term Friends and Quakers interchangeably. I believe in this particular piece, they'll use both of those terms, but both to refer to Quakers and Friends, the founders of our institution, Guilford College.
Family stories that they may not have known. An enormous collection of case files that the museum has that were from the American Friends Service Committee, which is the Quaker relief organization. They have traditionally tried to help individuals as humans in need, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of ethnic background. For example, the Quakers were among the very early abolitionist leaders in the anti-slavery movement in the United States. During World War I in 1917, to respond to the enormous need of especially children and other vulnerable populations away from the front lines of the war, the American Quakers founded a group called the American Friends Service Committee, or AFSC. That work continued up into the 1930s. After Kristallnacht, with the sudden flood of people needing assistance in fleeing Nazi Germany, the AFSC created a refugee division. That's the division that was tasked with helping individuals and families. The case files that we have are the files that were created by that division. A few years ago, I came across a file for the Hilsenrath children in France. They had been in a children's home in France after having been separated from their parents. Their parents had made it to the United States, separate from their children, and they were desperate to try to reunite. When I entered the names into Google, I was surprised to see that little Susie Hilsenrath is actually Susan Warsinger, who is one of the volunteers here at the museum.
I get this envelope in the mail, and I'm so excited because I started to read some of these papers and things that I just didn't even remember, letters my father wrote that I never knew that existed. I was born in Bad Kreuznach, Germany in 1929. As soon as Hitler came into power, my father lost his store. I couldn't go to public school. And then it was Kristallnacht. So that's when my parents decided we needed to get out. So then my father found a lady who was smuggling children into France. And we went to a little town called Brou-Vernay. And then I found out that my parents had come to the United States and that they had gotten in touch with whoever they could possibly get in touch with to try and find us. For me as an individual, I had this vague idea of how I got over here, but here I had individual records exactly how I got to come to the United States.
Taken together, this collection sheds light on the refugee experience and on the experiences of those trying to help refugees in ways that no other collection that we have can quite do.
I think it's going to be a record for my children and grandchildren, and not only for mine, but for all kinds of generations.
Until fairly recently, we've never had even a list of the names, and so now that we have that list and it's being made available through our website, I'm hoping to be able to make many more connections with people like Susan, that other people can help to answer questions that they may have wondered about for many years.
Right. So a very interesting connection between Friends and Jewish communities, refugees, very interesting connection, powerful connection, actually.
Families.
And so I mentioned George Fox earlier. At Guilford College, we do have some publicly named spaces after historical friends. And so George Fox, founder of Quaker Faith, we have a street, George Fox Road, You can see the painting, the portrait behind Gwen, perhaps in her background, and that's the thought leader to the conception of what we now know of as Guilford College, early founder. And here we have Nathan Hunt Road, who's pictured right behind of my colleague. And so the history, George Fox goes to what we often call the West Indies, and he sees slavery of Africans, enslaved Africans in mass form. He does speak out against slavery. And George Fox actually implores the Quakers, early friends, to treat their enslaved property well. He does fall short of calling for abolition. He does not do that, but he does say treat them well. It would be 100 years later before Friends would prohibit members from buying and selling enslaved people. It would take 100 years for the prohibition or the abolition to actually come within Quaker spaces. And so there are two early forerunners and many others that I'll mention. John Woolman is a name that's very well known in Quaker spaces, and he was a forerunner of the anti-slavery movement. Scholar Stephen J. White says Woolman most influenced anti-slavery forces in North Carolina. His approach was very different than Benjamin Lay, who I'll mention in just a moment. John Woolman, his approach was being involved in slavery. It separates us from our God. What we claim to be, this is a barrier. It separates us from our God. Benjamin Lay came with a very different message. So the title of, you can even see the titles of their books are quite distinct. And so John Woolman's title is Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes. However, Benjamin Lay's book, All Slaveholders That Keep Negroes in Bondage Are Apostates, meaning they're not even close to God. You know, they're not godly people. So he attacks the person, whereas Woolman attacks the character of the institution and the relationship and the separation. And so Benjamin Lay begins to go on Woolman goes on a speaking campaign and starts meeting people in their homes and speaking to early friends who were enslavers and trying to explain this dichotomy to them. Whereas Benjamin Lay had a lot of more radical approaches. For example, he would steal Quaker children. And to show the mothers and fathers, what would it be like if someone sold your child into slavery? See how this feels. He would give them back, but he would take their children. He would enter Quaker meetings, which oftentimes we use the word churches or the holy space. He would go into Quaker meetings and he would spew what appeared to be blood, and it was usually paint or dye, all over the people, and to say the blood is required to your hands. And so you can see he was very early disowned, is Quaker language for being excommunicated from the Quaker meetings for these tactics. So then centuries later, you have Levi Coffin. Levi Coffin, oftentimes termed the father of the Underground Railroad. And we also have a historical marker on our campus to Levi Coffin. We also have a road named after him, Levi Coffin Drive. I'm mentioning the public naming because at the very end of my 20 minutes or so with you, at the very end, you will see that the work that we're doing with our university studying slavery is troubling. Who have we decided to name our spaces after? Who is publicly recognized on our campus? So I'm being very specific in mentioning who has naming rights on our campus and where are we going with that? So Levi Coffin does some miraculous things. I am not a person who feels that these particular names should be there. There are some names that we trouble, but Levi Coffin is one. There are some troubling characteristics about his anti-slavery work, but I think the good outweighs the bad to the extent I'm fine with spaces being named after him. And so Levi Coffin helped over 3,000 enslaved Africans, shepherded them to freedom in collaboration with many others. He collaborated with Black abolitionists. He was a dealer in free labor goods. And so he was a merchant and would not sell goods if they had been produced with enslaved labor, which was not an easy feat in the 19th century. He also would often travel with African Americans, and he demanded that they have the same accommodations as he had. And he has been known to even give up his bedding for African Americans who were not given those accommodations. And he also petitioned the US government, because once the enslaved were liberated, they didn't have food, they didn't have shelter, they needed support. He petitioned the government to give homestays, to give land and food rations to newly freed enslaved Africans, and he got it. He received it. They gave it to him to be able to help these newly freed individuals. And there's more that I could say, but did some really laudable work, he and his wife. And so then I came across this quote, which really stunned me after everything that I just shared with you. And so this quote says, "The Quakers had the same difficulty as the Moravians," another religiously affiliated group in North Carolina, "in translating their profession into action. Although the Quakers were decidedly the best friends of the Negro, today, in the 1940s that is, Quakers as a rule hate Negroes, just as others of their race do." I was shocked when I read Carter G. Woodson, for those who may not know, the founder of what was Negro History Week, now Black History Month. And so I was shocked that he's saying this, everyone that we consider to be friends and abolitionists, he's saying they actually hate the Negro. And so I wanted to know more about that, and hence my research began. I found that Levi Coffin said something very similarly. He says, "I have very little faith in Quaker meetings. The real cause of the Civil War is not even alluded to. The poor slaves are not remembered in their prayers, and the sin of slavery is not even mentioned. The same pro-slavery spirit that's around them ruled the Quaker church so long still exists, for we are partners in the national sin." So very similar, he's calling out his own community of Quakers, saying there is a mantra of abolitionism, but we're far from it, far from it. And he's calling out what he's seeing in that day. And I will just give a caveat that a lot of the work at first, Levi Coffin is trying to only work with Quakers. He knows them to be his community. And as you can see from the previous quote, it's not working well. He's receiving a lot of opposition. And so it actually forces him to start looking outside of Quaker spaces for support. And he begins to work with a lot of these denominations that you see on your screen. I do not find yet in my research a link between Quaker abolition and Jewish communities. Not that it's not there, I just haven't found that yet in my research. And so Levi Coffin and other Quakers work very closely with Black abolitionists. And so, but they are not named on our campuses, or they're not named in a lot of these spaces. And so we're doing a lot of work on our campus to say their names. We actually had a program called Say Their Names, where we're trying to bring these names out to the forefront. So General Hamilton Saul, I'll start with him. Levi Coffin writes, "We employed General Hamilton Saul, a gray-haired, trusty old Negro, to examine every coffle of slaves to which he could gain access and ascertain if there were any kidnapped Negroes among them." And so you can see by Levi Coffin's own pen, he cannot do the work of abolition without employing African Americans to help him in this work. And so we're trying to bring those names above ground. And so here we have two scholars, Adrian Israel and David Soselski, who say the free Black communities in North Carolina supported the Underground Railroad. David Soselski says fugitive slaves received their most important backing from other slaves. Again, these community members are oftentimes not named. And the white Quaker abolitionists are very prominent in our communities. So Quakers have the trustee system. They find a legal loophole where they purchase the enslaved. There's a law in North Carolina that churches or religious institutions can purchase property. Well, at this time, enslaved people are property. And so Quakers find a legal loophole where they begin to purchase the enslaved for the purpose of liberating them. or at least giving them a better life, or at least hiring them out so that they can actually earn money from their labor. That's a complicated system that we don't have time to talk about right now, but the premise of the system does cause for the liberation of many enslaved Africans. So Quakers began to kind of debate over some of these questions. And they have a query, which is a question they put before the people, and sometimes they'll have committees who will then wrestle with those questions and give responses. And so it's one thing to liberate these enslaved Africans, but when you start by the dozens and hundreds, what do you do with them? Once the church is now the owners of hundreds, 1,000 or more of enslaved Africans, what do you do with them? And so a question is on the table that says, would it be an act of humanity to emancipate our slaves? And notice they're saying our because legally they own them, and send them to Haiti or the African colony without their consent. So they're asking, what do we do with these individuals? And do we send them away with their consent or without their consent? This is a very important question because this is supposed to be a different type of a situation. But how is this different from enslaved people who are sold away without their consent? So the response is, we should be governed by what our own judgment would tell us. They actually say at the start of this answer, although it would seem more humane to send them with their consent, we should be governed by what our own judgment tells us. So they understand the humane thing to do is to get the enslaved Africans' consent before sending them away. However, they decide not to do that because they say, we know better. We can think better than they can. And so this becomes a huge problem where enslaved Africans are sent to countries like Haiti, Liberia, without their consent. Some willingly, but many without their consent. And so we have the cousin of Levi Coffin, Addison Coffin. He leaves a book behind, he writes a book and he says, what to do with the Negro when freed was the serious question. Various plans were before the people. Some said colonize them to Africa. That was advocated by many. Others were decidedly in favor of sending them to Haiti, while some were in favor of French Guiana. None seemed willing for them to remain in North Carolina. Many of the most conscientious anti-slavery men and women were strongly opposed to their remaining. Many would rather they remain in slavery. They would rather they remain in slavery than to stay amongst them. And that's for a lot of different reasons. They said it was expensive to keep them. There are issues with Quakers being able to marry other Quakers. And if we proselytize them, if they come into the church, then these Black men may end up with our white daughters. Then some of them simply said that the state was so racist, we have to get them out of North Carolina because it's for their own good, it's too racist. Others, we simply do not want them among us. It's too much of a responsibility. And so Levi Coffin leaves North Carolina in 1826 and goes to Indiana. So this will become very important because we will now, this question of what do we do with the Negroes once freed, once Levi Coffin and there's a huge exodus out of North Carolina because Quakers are highly prosecuted because of this activity. So there's an exodus out of North Carolina to Indiana. And so they begin to ferry these enslaved Africans to Indiana for freedom because it's a free state in Indiana. And so in Indiana, they worked very closely with the African-American community there, just like they had learned to do in North Carolina. And so George de Baptiste was one of the main contacts with whom, and he's an African-American man, very fair-skinned, but an African-American man with whom they worked in concert once he got to Indiana. And so what happens when the enslaved Africans get to Indiana? What is their treatment amongst Quakers in Indiana? There are many records that remain in our archives from the North Carolina yearly meeting and also references to the Indiana yearly meeting. And so William Parker, a very prominent abolitionist family, he writes back to North Carolina and he says, Blacks are not wanted here. So the same issue they have in North Carolina of not wanting the Blacks amongst them there, they don't want them, the Friends, the Quakers do not want them in Indiana either for many of the same reasons. And so we're not seeing a network of my neighbor, you know. And so they're even willing to pay $20 to get them out of Wayne County. Someone says a better plan would be to colonize them somewhere in the Southwest. And then a note in one of the letters that I read in our archives, Friends in North Carolina learned that Quakers in Indiana were resentful toward North Carolina Friends for sending so many Blacks there. This is not the public narrative of Quaker abolitionism, just let me tell you. It is always presented in many facets as a loving connection, interracial connection. Later on, early on, not even the interracial piece is oftentimes mentioned. But you don't get these nuances that we're sharing with you today of how complicated that network really was. So these are just some of the numbers in the different time periods. 350 owned by Friends, and that number will continue to rise. Over 100 resettled to Haiti, 650 resettled to free states, over 400 resettled to Liberia. And so we have a letter at the start of our call. Ronnie was asking, what is our relationship with other Quaker institutions? This letter actually comes from one of our sister institutions. I think it's Earlham. I believe it came from Earlham. And they shared this with our archives. And so there is a woman, Hannah Elliott, who writes a letter back to North Carolina to that same Parker family that I mentioned before. And she's trying to find her relatives who have been recolonized to Liberia or Haiti. She has no idea where they are. Friends, this is very similar to what happened in slavery, when you had enslaved people whose family members had been sold away and they can't find them. And so Hannah Elliott writes a letter. Someone wants to know where her brother Samuel and his wife are. She wants to know her children's ages. She's lost her paper she had. Also her brother Robert, she wants to know whether he has gone to Liberia or not. Sarah is living with Mrs. Crane. Hannah wishes to know whether her mother's husband has gone to Liberia with his wife or not, written in 1829, trying to locate friends and family. And so this brings me to my closing. I mentioned spaces that our buildings and our roads are named after on our college campus. Lavina Curry, sometimes called Vina Curry, this is a primary source from our archives where her name is written in the ledger book and her earnings are written there. She was a free Black woman and her husband was a free Black man, Archibald Curry. And so remember I talked about the exodus out of North Carolina up to Indiana. And so Vida Curry was a washerwoman at what is now Guilford College. Then it was New Garden Boarding School. But she was a washerwoman or a laundress there. Her husband passed away and she allowed his freedmen's papers to be used by escaped slaves or freedom seekers. And she would allow them to use his papers and get north to Indiana to Levi Coffin. Levi Coffin would then find refuge for these freedom seekers, send the papers back down to North Carolina. And Vida Curry, we have records that she did this at least 15 times. We have slave codes. I have to put this in perspective in North Carolina, that forging freedmen's papers was punishable by 39 lashes on the bare back. Some people died from those lashes. Imagine 39 times 15 lashes on the bare back. She risked this, and she was a free woman. She was employed. We have the records to prove it. One could say, why would she risk it all? But she did. And she worked on our campus and was doing this activity in our community. And there are no public naming spaces to Vida Curry on our campus. We are very excited to share that next year, next year, 2022, we will have a public marker and a naming ceremony to Vida Curry on our campus. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Gwen, to share more.
Share now. Okay. So my name is Gwen Erickson, and I'm going to pick up where Krishauna left off, basically, and really focus on the college itself in this conversation of complicity and complexity. I also will be using kind of the tradition that Krishauna brought up of having queries as a part of this. I like to ask kind of these questions to get us thinking as we go through this information. The image you see here is actually of our very first building here on the campus. This is one of the earliest images of the institution in the 19th century. So questions I'd like to have us ponder as we enter this. What narratives guide us? Who created them? What do they tell us? Whose stories are dominant in the printed sources? How do concepts of religious identity, cultural identity, and racial identity influence this narrative construction? Whose stories are left out? How might perceptions change when considering these other perspectives? What you see here on the screen are some artifacts from our archives from the Peck family collection. Much of what we know about the initial years of New Garden Boarding School at the time when Vina Curry was employed here on our campus comes from candid observations by Harriet Peck, whose silhouette is here on the left of our screen. Harriet came to North Carolina from Rhode Island. She was a Quaker and an abolitionist there, and very much wanted to come south in order to get firsthand experience of living in an area where there was slavery, so that she could know firsthand, kind of what she was up against. And she was heartened by the fact that she felt a number of the people at the boarding school that she interacted with were what she called good abolitionists. And by that, she meant people who were committed to the immediate end of slavery, not just sort of talking theoretically about an eventual end or slavery's bad and it would be nice if we didn't have it, but actually making some concrete decisions to bring it to an end. Harriet brought with her anti-slavery tracts, and she was an active subscriber to William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. We actually have issues of The Liberator that belong to Harriet Peck and her family that we use with our students in courses. So we know that she was circulating these, providing these to students to read, as well as sharing them with other Quakers in the community. Included in those that she was considering good abolitionists were the superintendents of the boarding school and a couple of the key trustees. It would be incorrect to imply that this applied to all North Carolina Quakers, but it is interesting to note how the documentation we do have for that particular stance at least being present within our state. Others had, perhaps more conservative views of, I'm not enslaving people personally. I can't, it's not up to me to tell my neighbors what to do. And if I'm not enslaving people, then I'm not responsible for the evils of slavery. Others were taking stances such as what Krishauna mentions of actively looking for ways to further distance themselves through decisions about purchases, ethical investments, and so forth. As Krishauna already mentioned, Vina Curry was on our campus during this time period as well. However, Peck does not mention her, which I think is a thing to trouble that, sort of began occurring as I analyzed her work. Why don't we see and know more about the African Americans we know were present? She does mention a couple of other African Americans who she met, and she was teaching to read, which was an illegal activity at that time period. So we do know she met them, but we don't know much about the particular individuals and what her relationship was with them. Yep. Here's the Liberator that I mentioned. The first years of New Garden Boarding School were a beacon of hope. I use this graphic a lot of times with classes of showing the evolution of attitude towards the possibilities of slavery ending and the kind of changes within the abolitionist movement in the 1830s as you started to have more strident calls for full abolition. We know that the students and staff of the boarding school read this and other controversial literature. I have not found anything quite as candid as what Peck has in terms of assessments of how campus was reacting to this abolitionist literature. But we do know that with Harriet that there were still activities going on in the 1830s that it might be presumed had ended in the 1820s when Levi Coffin left North Carolina. So it stands to reason there was probably continuing abolitionist activities happening within North Carolina Quakerism in the 1840s and 1850s after Harriet Peck's death, but that's still information to be teased out. But much of what we do pick up is from murky anecdotes and stories, and looking at examples of individual Quakers taking extra legal steps and institutional steps that perhaps less controversial, but still notable of their day, of petitioning the legislature and kind of keeping it in front of people in power that slavery needed to come to an end. Another point I'd like to make is that Krishauna mentions one of the reasons why friends might have a discomfort with maintaining a connection to African Americans post-freedom is that they did not want to have the risk of necessarily having them become full and equal members of their own society. So Quakers at this time were practicing endogamy. So if you had someone who was a member of the Quaker meeting, those were the only people you could marry. So if you had African Americans who were becoming members in good standing, you were opening up for your daughters to, you know, have that ever feared marrying a Black man. It's notable that the one verified active member of a North Carolina Quaker meeting during this 19th century time period was an older man who was not of real marriageable age, and he joined individually without family. So this is a picture here of the New Garden Friends Meeting House, which is located across the street from where we are today. This particular structure does not stand today, but is the same property. There's actually a marker for where the building once stood. And I point this out as it was done in 1869, but it really shows kind of what the kind of community would have looked like during that mid-19th century time period that we're speaking of. The Quaker community was pretty much exclusively white. We do have examples of African Americans who would attend if there was a particular visitor, a visiting minister or someone coming through, you know, that was very much a public occasion. So we do know that African Americans would attend some services, but were not being, you know, welcomed as equals into that, that faith community. There are references to African Americans attending public meetings that other non-white, non-Quakers would also be attending. And we also know that they would have lived nearby in the community. But the Quaker community was very much a network for his neighbors and business networks and so forth that tended to be relatively closed in terms of the records that we can see. One of the things to tease out is to then look at civil records and non-Quaker records to see how much people were following what was the discipline of and the ideals that they were to be following, and how much were they by human nature expanding beyond those. And that's where you get into some really interesting stories about dynamics in terms of enslavement and relationships with business transactions in the community. There's the official story, and then there's maybe what some individuals were doing that perhaps would not fit with the recommended practices. So many local Quaker families could not afford the tuition, and the school began to open up as we get into the 1850s. So what began as a closed, kind of hedged, protected space centered on Quaker values still was exclusively Quaker in terms of the faculty and administration, but open to non-Quaker students. And with that, by the 1850s, you have the majority of the students are white non-Quakers. Post-Civil War, you really have the school's ethos being not terribly different from a lot of your other Christian denominational schools of the era. I like to share this particular quote by Guilford historian Alex Stossen. He wrote this in 1999. During Reconstruction, the school and North Carolina Yearly Meeting came to the same conclusion on how to deal with the lost cause. Since Quakers had opposed slavery and not supported the Confederacy, anger and bitter words were directed at them. To fend this off, Quakers lost interest in African Americans and assumed the mantle of victimhood. This in turn led to them becoming as Southern as possible and to blend in fully into the emerging culture of segregation in the late 19th century. And I'll mention, just because of this particular audience, I think this has some interesting parallels with studies I've read about Judaism in the South and some of the decisions that Southern Jews have made of being, religious practicing Jews, but culturally borrowing a lot of the cultural norms of their local Southern community and kind of blending in with whiteness to not be seen as other as much. So while Quakers were not ethnically different, tended to be perhaps more of a bias toward Anglo, but still pretty widespread of white ethnicities, they were distinctive by their earlier anti-slavery stances and were seeking during the Reconstruction era to be accepted into their regional fold and identifying more with the white dominant culture than looking at continuing to trouble the racial divide. So I'll get here pulling on some of the themes that Krishauna mentioned of what we have named and not named on our campus. I incorrectly, kind of assumed and then realized, wait a second, there's a slide that we talk about, and the rhetoric we always say is Quakers spoke with discomfort of slavery, but did not prohibit interaction with slavery for a century. What this means is that Quakers in North Carolina, in the Caribbean, in anywhere in the Atlantic world, who were active Quakers in good standing prior to the 1770s, very easily could be, especially if they had wealth and power attached to them, complicit with the institution of slavery. So with that, I did a little bit of research. We still have to do more research to see exactly how entangled and enmeshed, but our campus building you see here, our oldest building still standing on campus, our 1837 building was rebuilt in the 20th century. So our oldest continuous building in operation is the 1884 Archdale Hall. Archdale Hall is named for a colonial Quaker governor, John Archdale, who was English. He had connections to the early colonial settlement of both Maine and the Carolinas. He was governor of the Carolinas before it was divided into North and South Carolina. And so it was primarily during his time in the colonies based in Charleston. But obviously someone who was very well connected. He was a proprietor, owned immense land holdings and wealth and connections within the British Empire. So this is a example of someone who we presume, because of their being labeled as a Quaker, that they must be on the right side of history and choosing the side of justice in how they governed. The original rationale for why this building is named Archdale Hall is actually documented in our trustee minutes. and also in anecdotes told at the time in the 19th century. One of our major trustees, Francis T. King, who Krishauna's office is in King Hall, was a benefactor in this 1870s and 1880s. And there was talk of the new building being named for him. And he was not wanting a building named for him and said, there is Archdale, your Quaker governor, a man who should be held in remembrance. You have splendid names in Carolina, which should be perpetuated. And the trustees recorded in deciding to name this building in 1885 that the building was being named in memory of Governor Archdale, who was a member of our society and who gave so much satisfaction to his administration in 1695. And much of the documents and discussions of Archdale are about him and how he promoted key Quaker values. Archdale had was known for his diplomacy with the Spanish, St. Augustine in Florida, and his also with his negotiations with Native Americans in South Carolina. And this was held up as, similar to how William Penn and his diplomacy is held up in Pennsylvania history. What isn't mentioned in any of the Quaker sources, but can be found with further digging, is he also was governor of the Carolinas when a comprehensive slave law was passed. And if you know anything about slavery in South Carolina, there's a lot more similarities to slavery there to the West Indies, which is a much more brutal type of institutionalization of slavery, larger scale operations. And at this time in the 1690s, that type of large scale kind of plantation labor that you associate with the Deep South had not yet really entrenched itself on the mainland and was primarily limited to the Caribbean. However, this particular act in the 1690s during Archdale's time as governor were known as Archdale's laws. The other kind of interesting thing with Archdale that he's credited with is introducing seed rice from Madagascar to South Carolina, which once again, this shows it's complicated. Archdale may not have been thinking through anything with that except, oh, here's a good crop, it probably will grow well. But if you take it to the next step, we know that the rice plantations in South Carolina were some of the more brutal industries really taking advantage and brutalizing enslaved labor. So this becomes a piece that we look at our own campus. Why are we honoring Archdale? Who was he and what was his story? And what names do we have and do we know the complexities they might represent? Here I have a photograph of John Pitts, who we have documented as one of the laborers who was hired to help construct Archdale Hall. We actually have some of our most comprehensive records of construction workers for Archdale Hall because it was an early building. This wasn't something that was being contracted to another agency. The college was directly hiring and paying for carpenters and brick masons and so forth. And through that, we've been able to begin to document a lot of our earliest African-American staff who were employed at the institution during that time period from the 1870s up until the 1960s, when the college finally integrated and began to have African-American students and African-American faculty for the first time. This is a picture of our first faculty at Guilford College, and you'll, unsurprisingly, exclusively white, but perhaps surprisingly to some, and this is part of the narrative of Guilford College, you actually have one more woman, there's an additional woman. So you actually have a majority female first faculty for our institution. We were founded as coeducational. When we transformed from a boarding school to a college, we remained coeducational, and our first graduating class included both men and women, and the faculty included both men and women as instructors. This doesn't mean necessarily that they received the same pay or other things, but it was at least this movement towards equality. So much of the narrative that's held up about Guilford's legacy is this deep Quaker value of equality, and look how we had both men and women represented from the earliest period of our school. These are some images I like to use with workshops and presentations to see who is visible and who remains invisible as we look at our college's history. And this is especially useful because you're coming to an age where you have photography to help tell the story. The large image here is labeled as a photograph of the entire Friends School community. It shows all the students and all the teachers and the administrators all there. What it does not include is any of the behind the scenes staff, the Vina Curries of the day. On the left is Anne Brown, who was employed as a cook and worked at the college for several decades. And we know from records would have been employed at the school at this time that this larger group photograph was taken. There are references sometimes to her and people enjoying her cooking and things like that, but she is not considered a full member of the community in the level to be included in the photographs or the alumni directories and so forth that document all those that are pictured in the group image. This here is a photograph of just showing and naming some of those people who were staff at the institution during these years when they were underdocumented. So one piece of the narrative we're changing is instead of saying there were no African Americans at Guilford College until we integrated in 1962, is making sure we not use that phrase, that we recognize there has always been an African American presence at the college since founding in the 1830s. However, it's whose stories were being told and who is being named as being a part of the institution's history. Krishauna and I have really enjoyed connecting with descendants of these individuals who are able to give us more information and fill some of those gaps and really show how integral these individuals were to the campus community. So Guilford College was known as this kind of progressive, open, equal school. And it's shocking to a lot of people when they see this particular slide of items pulled from standard 20th century materials of the day. The other year, there was a lot of scandals going around with politicians being found in yearbooks and schools wondering if they should pull all the yearbooks from the library so that people wouldn't find their racism from the 1950s and 1960s. And when those started making headlines, I contacted the vice president of marketing and said, heads up, I already made all our yearbooks available online digitally, so barn doors open. Anyone wants to find stuff. And also heads up, if you're assuming because you're a marketing director at a Quaker college that you don't have to worry about it, think again. But the good news is we know, so we're not going to be blindsided. And so these are some of the examples of how Guilford in the 20th century was very much, historically white, denominational, Christian college in the South, with all that entailed. We did include Jewish students and faculty prior to the inclusion of African Americans. Some of those connections were directly coming out of some of the work that Krishauna talks about, people who connected to Quakers through refugee resettlement. So here we have Fred Katz, who went on to become a prominent sociologist studying the Holocaust. And J. Kurt Victorious, who was actually ended up mostly being involved with the Quaker faith community after he came to Guilford, but was ethnically Jewish and had lost his job in Berlin. So we ended up with an amazing economist at our institution for a number of years because of that movement that many other colleges benefited from, of having people who had to flee from Europe from leading academic jobs to find employment in the US. I also like to complicate things by showing that Guilford Quakers were not the only ones engaged in social justice work at the institution. And some Quakers were among the more progressive, and others were perhaps a bit disappointing to us as we look back in retrospect. The individual we see here pictured on the left and then on the center portrait later on was a sociology professor at Guilford in the 1930s and 1940s who really took a leading role. He's also academic dean. And took a leading role in interracial activities and building partnerships between Guilford students and students at the two historically Black universities here in our town, and was really pushing it to have greater openness towards integration at Guilford. He actually left Guilford to become president at a historically Black college, and dedicated much of the remaining part of his career specifically to Black education. So this is one of those missed opportunities. You wonder what might have happened if he had stayed in a leadership role at the institution. However, he left. Brown versus Board of Education happened in 1954. A number of faculty and students began to say, well, okay, when can we have African-American students here? The trustees denied that there was a policy against admitting African-American students. However, it was well known that the chair of the trustees would, put those files in the other drawer if they came in. We have through community information, we do know that several qualified applicants did apply and were not accepted, with some excuse found for why they would not be a good fit for Guilford. In 1962, we had our first African and African-American students join the community. 1960 Greensboro becomes prominent in the broader news as the home of the Woolworth sit-ins. And this shows here that Guilford College's community was divided on that issue as well, of whether or not students who were wanting to participate in desegregation activities should or shouldn't. And so the majority of people took a neutral stance on the issue. And to bring up some of the voices that get left out, rather than having a quote from a president or trustee, I'd like to hold up Mary Ellen Cathy, who is a longtime cook in one of our dormitories and kind of a mother to several generations of Guilford women students. And one of her quotes that she said in an interview was that you don't know everything. She was one of the people we have documented who was part of the Guilford community in that early 1960s who was active in desegregation activities. So once again, we've come full circle with some of those on our campus who are holding up the values that we espouse the best in trying times are actually the underdocumented staff members of color like Verna Curley and like Mary Ellen Cathy. I'd also like to hold up and acknowledge our first African-American students. This picture here shows the first Black student organization that was founded. While we integrated in 1962, the initial faculty and students of color coming were very much individuals. And so it wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s that you had a sufficient number of African-American students to actually have their own student organization and be supporting each other in their campus experience. And I'd like to close with some acknowledgements of recognizing our land here at Guilford sits on that of the Kiowa and Sara people, and recognizing all those whose stories are coming to be known and all those that remain to be told. And we'll close with some queries for conversation and consideration and open to questions. So I'll just read these and then turn things over to our host to handle the Q&A. How do we negotiate Guilford's Quaker heritage and current landscape as a space with a deep and long aspirational values associated with social justice, and as one entangled in a culture of white supremacy? What narratives do we tell ourselves and others about our past? Are we aware of the privileges that exist for some and not others? Does our narrative of valuing equality function as silent instances when our institutional, cultural, and practices have discouraged rather than cultivated equity and inclusion? How do we start the difficult process of reframing our Quaker narratives to honor our abolitionist past while acknowledging unbearable truths? How does my understanding of history inform my own worldview and actions today?
Thank you both very much. Sorry about the muting there. Thank you both very much. These were, I mean, just extremely eye-opening presentations, and so many questions, I think, that are quite relevant to the discussion that we have been having in my class and in the broader discussion. I think you could actually open up all of the questions that you just posted, the queries that you raise. Institutions have to look at these things. They have to look at themselves. They have to understand themselves. And I think you've shown such a beautiful example of a graceful kind of engagement and encounter with this history. If you don't mind, I'd like to just kind of take the advantage of being the chair here and ask a question of my own. I was very interested in the opening of your presentation, Krishauna, in terms of the documents of the kind of conversionary documents that were brought in, and I really do appreciate you kind of bringing that in as part of this discussion of reevaluation. You know, it was one of the things that we've kind of encountered in my class is you know, that there is a kind of challenging history between organized Jewish institutions, Jewish individuals, and abolitionism, and in no small part there was a sense that Jews were both tarred by abolitionists as perpetuators of enslavement and in the slave trade, as well as feeling that they were being targeted, you know, for conversionary efforts. So even if there was a kind of sympathy, that they felt often at odds. This kind of changes with different waves of Jewish immigration. But one of the things that we've had to struggle with in our class, you know, is the fact that you know, historically there is something to the critique of Jewish slaveholding. That this was we had a guest 2 weeks ago, a professor at Arizona State who you know, has really devoted his research to Jamaica. And the situation, as he used actually the term, you know, entanglements, complicated entanglements, you know, all the, you know, so these all kind of tying together. I guess if I wanted to sort of bring a question out of all of this word salad that I just put out, is you know, how do you know, that parallel of sort of engagement as a group that at least in some degree is outside of the mainstream of you know, white Protestant culture, that dictated so much of the cultural structure here, right? Having to engage on some level and finding it easier to sort of accommodate the dominant you know, culture, and I'm thinking in particular of the redemption period, the post-Reconstruction period. So to what extent, I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, to what extent do you think, you know, how do we break that kind of cycle? You know, so often it becomes an issue of, you know, going along, and we've seen this, you know, I would argue over the last few years, going along with things that are you know, problematic, for the sake of preserving or protection. I'm sorry, this is kind of a vague question, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
No, and Gwen and I talked about that actually today. We had that exact same conversation today. That it is a complexity. It really is. The way that we have been wrestling with that just within our own research, is just presenting those complexities. And it is a cycle as well. It is a cycle. So what we see in the 17th century, the 18th century, they continue to be cyclical, even as we look in the 20th century, even if we look today. And so we're constantly naming those things, making those connections for people. And I will even bring another element that goes right along with what you just said. So remember, I showed you the American Friends Services Committee and the work that they were doing with refugees. So Jews called them out quite a bit, because they said, you're doing all of this refugee work, this resettlement work, this humanitarian work in the 1930s and 40s, but you're not calling out Nazism. You are refusing to call out Nazism. And in the documents that I read, the response to that from the Quaker community was, we fear that if we call that out, then the Nazi Germany will force us to, or Europeans will force us to stop the humanitarian aid if we call that out. And so they were wrestling with being silent on the horrors of Nazism with wanting to continue to help the people who needed it the most. And that was a negotiation that they made that had a lot of consequences. I don't have to tell a Jewish community how many consequences that silence had. So what we've been doing is presenting all of that. These are the complexities of all of these stories. And then these are the ways that they're perpetuated over time. And then not just presenting them, but what can we do to interrupt them? And so part of our disruptions have been naming new spaces in different ways. It's been communicating, especially Gwen, with those descendant communities, bringing in voices that normally would never have been at the table. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, a couple things. One, I mean, I think a lot of what you're talking about, I've seen a lot in a lot of the more recent scholarship dealing with Christian missionary movements, and a lot of agencies that have had to really grapple with service organizations grappling with shifting, their work from how they would have approached dealing with, going into other communities, with any kind of service project and so forth. There's that whole evaluation. Are you doing this to save people? Or are you doing this to serve in partnership? And that dichotomy there. And I think that conversation and some of those theories play out a little bit here. Another thing that I want to build on with Krishauna's mentioning that, and I think applies especially to institutions such as educational institutions. Couple points. One is the idea of how to be inclusive while still maintaining one's values. So you say, well, we have to do it this way because this is the Quaker way. And that's not to say you shouldn't maintain certain faith traditions, but there comes that check of considering, are we wanting to maintain these faith traditions out of our own comfort? And is this really a practicing element of our faith, or is this really a cultural practice that is not coming from our relationship, and our, is this coming out of prayer? Is this coming out of discernment? Or is this coming out of, but this is the way we've always done it? And I think that also comes up with some of the cyclical stuff that we see sometimes, where the person that maybe had the calling as a matter of faith to engage in with what we're dealing with now with the abolitionist activities, then are their children continuing certain practices out of habit, or are they really feeling that kind of vocational call to something? Or are they sort of coasting on their parents' coattails, to put it bluntly? And I think that's another reason where you sometimes will have things where you'll see these reference points. Oh, well, our ancestors did this, so check, we've taken care of that. We don't have to complicate, we don't have to trouble, we don't have to get a headache wondering where we were on history on that, because our ancestors went through this process. Our ancestors suffered for us, so we don't have to, ponder these hard decisions.
Well, it's sort of like what you were saying in terms of the collective reflection of Quaker, which is how I understood it, right? I understood the narrative of Quakers being the good guys, and I mean, not that they weren't, right. But everybody's good and bad, right? I mean, there's
that's right.
So I wanted a question kind of came up in the chat here that I think it's an interesting question. It's a very it's a big one. So Sarah, who you can see there, writes, what is the risk of transparency about the origins of universities? They are facts, true regardless of acknowledgement. How do we expect to do better when we refuse to learn history? Now, she writes, that's simplistic, I know. I very much disagree with that assessment of it being a simplistic question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. In doing this work, I've worked at a couple of institutions that are engaging in this work. And I've worked at institutions that there are a lot of risks to doing this work. And so I want to be really honest about that. You need to know where you are and know your people, because people take a lot of ownership of history and stories, even if they are not true. I mean, even if the research shows otherwise, or even if that narrative needs to be complicated, people take a lot of ownership. And stories are used as propaganda. Stories are used for marketing. Stories are used, in all sorts of ways. And so I have seen institutions where if you cite the wrong history, there could really be consequences for that. I have lived that and I have seen that. And so doing this work, it takes education of the entire community. It really does. So when we first started presenting this work, we had Board of Trustee members, who were in the space with us, who were learning right alongside of us. It really does take education of the entire community. And I asked really pointed questions before, because I had experiences in the past where things didn't go so well when you start bringing out certain histories. And so I started just asking really pointed questions of my VP and people above her. Are we ready for what this may unfold? And we need to have that conversation before we start, unveiling a lot of this information, because what you unveil, it could be distinct from what you think is there. Right. And so, and we need to know, are we ready for that? Everyone said yes. And we went forward with the work.
But we're always wondering, at which point is there a step?
That's right.
And what I find is, as Krishauna said, it's this cyclical thing. And so in some ways, I kind of take the easy way out. I always end my presentations with lots of questions. So I'm not telling you there's a connection between this, this, and this. I'm just asking you to think about things. And more often than not, pre-pandemic, I'd meet someone in the cafeteria or on the sidewalk, or sometimes during the Q&A or something, someone would say, well, you said this, and there's this, and I'm observing this dynamic happening at our institution. Is there a connection here? And that's what's going to will get us in trouble. I mean, at what point do people start to say, if this was true then, how does this replicate something happening more recently? Also, as you get into living memories, I haven't had any pushback talking about Archdale because no one knew Archdale. I have heard some murmurings on my presentation, which, to keep to time, I didn't go into details here, but I think I mentioned the chair of the trustees was known to, everyone knew he was not willing to have Black students at Guilford. And so, if you're the head of admissions, you don't need a policy to keep you from letting someone in if the trustee is not going to be cool with it. And, I name him in some of my presentations, and one of our current trustees, knew him as, you know, as Bob Frazier was, you know, fading towards retirement. Ed was an up and coming local attorney, and they were both, you know, they're both attorneys. They know each other, you know, so that starts to trouble a bit when you say, I knew him. He was a good guy. You're being a little too harsh on him there. Yeah.
I feel like that's a conversation a lot of people are having these days.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Laura, go for it. Oh, I'm sorry, I should say this is the portion where I open up. Hi, Laura, go ahead.
Thank you for the very informative speech. I have a technical question about how Guilford acts as an undergrad. I attend Stern College for Women, which is an undergraduate university of yeshiva. When I am a creative writing major, but as all other Stern women, I am expected to major in Judaic studies. I'm wondering if there are some Christian Quaker affiliated classes in your undergraduate or graduate program.
Want me to take that, or are you going to?
Yes, go for it.
So Guilford, Guilford's interesting because it does not have any formal religious ties present day, and actually has not for a fairly lengthy time period. It is Quaker by choice, in terms of, you know, we had the founding and so forth, but it's a self-perpetuating board. And the Board of Trustees made a commitment that the majority of the board members are Quakers. However, they decide if that person that is up for consideration to be a board member is, the right kind of Quaker. It's not there. So you're not getting into any kind of theological debate on that. So we're not associated with a particular branch or so forth. So this is just backstory to kind of lead up to the fact. So there are no required chapels or required expectations that people are taking Quaker studies courses. However, we do have a Friends Center on campus that helps to steward our Quaker studies concentration. So their students can choose the same way they could choose to be like a minor in women and gender studies, or in, you know, you could be a physics major with a chemistry minor. You could also be a physics major with a Quaker studies concentration. So we do have some students that choose probably to come here in order to have that particular option for coursework that wouldn't be at other institutions. But it is just at the undergraduate level at this point.
And I would just add to that, and Howard, I see your hand. I would just add to that when Gwen and I we do workshops all throughout campus on what we just presented to you, because the common core of our community, they don't know this information either. And so we're presenting, just like we're presenting it to you, we have to present it to them. And something that always comes out of those conversations is, why isn't this information required? It should be a required part of, if you matriculate at Guilford College, you should have to learn this history that Gwen and I or whomever are giving. And so that's something that that's always on the table. We'll see where it goes.
Mm-hmm.
Howard, why don't you bring us home with our last question of the evening?
Good evening, and thank you both very, very much for a tremendous topic and an area that we really don't know much about, and we're truly, truly educated by this. And I think you're doing great work with your program there and your projects and everything. As someone who was a teenager in the late 50s and early 60s and everything, I think the school is near Greensboro, where the infamous Woolworth counter is.
Yes.
And of course, I grew up glued to the TV with George Wallace and seeing what happened in Alabama and the governor in Little Rock and everything like that. Can you give me some detail about what did happen in 1962 when you integrated for the first time?
So where do we start? Do we start with Friends Services, or go for it? You start us off, Gwen. I'll add if something needs to be added.
So it wasn't a out of the blue thing to integrate in 1962. It kind of had to happen. Two reasons. One, that it had to happen. We are not a school of immense wealth, and there was civil rights legislation coming down the pike that was going to cut off certain amounts of federal funding for schools that were not integrated. That's not to say that all the schools integrated. My father's alma mater, University of Richmond, who is another institution that's engaged in the University Studying Slavery group, they actually turned down federal funding and didn't integrate until fall of 1968. Guilford had the additional pressure of, there was an international Quaker organization that the college was wanting to host for their major once a generation conference. And the international organization said, we can't accept your invitation yet, because we need to be assured that every delegate who might come to this conference would be equally welcomed to your institution during the academic year. And so that conference was held in 1967, but this is pre-internet. It took a while to arrange a major international conference. So they were making the site decisions, in the late 50s, early 60s. And so they went ahead and started recruiting some Kenyan Quaker students. And so in fall 1962, we had 2 Kenyan Quaker students and 1 local African-American student enter at Guilford. I also like to hold up our African-American student who integrated Guilford is an amazing, amazing man. Krishauna and I have gotten to meet him. He lives, maybe 30 minutes from campus. He turned down Morehouse for us. Mm. So he knew, and his high school, guidance counselor said, I'm hearing Guilford's ready. You'd be a good person for that. And he turned in Morehouse. So he was an outstanding student who is kind of this singular model to come in and do that. And the state schools had already integrated. The other private denominational schools in the region, those that didn't integrate in 62 did by 63 because of that federal piece. So you weren't seeing pickets or anything like that. And also keep in mind, our Black student organization, who is being Black and proud, doesn't exist until 68, 69. 62, you've got Wadakila and Ayub and James, who are just these 3 guys just going to class. So it's not pushing buttons at that point.
Thank you.
So I want to thank Krishauna and Gwen very much for taking the time with us this evening. I second the 3rd or 4th or 5th, a number of people have been saying the same thing about how just really informative, really just really terrific program. And we're so grateful for you coming to visit us today. So I want to thank our sponsors of Crisis and Hope, the YU Center for Israel Studies, and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, and Judaic Studies at YU Madai HaYahadut. For more information about our ongoing and upcoming events, please visit yu.edu/crisisandhope. And for recordings of our previous events and this one soon, www.yu.edu/crisisandhope/past recordings. Join us next week on February 23rd for a special Purim presentation, La Santa Esther Among the Crypto Jews of the Americas, featuring Emily Colbert Cairns of Salve Regina University in conversation with our own and my friend and colleague, Ronnie Perellis. Look forward to seeing you then.